Welcome back to Campfire Horror Tales. Tonight, we're taking you to a remote, haunted lighthouse perched on a lonely cliff off the coast. This is a true horror story, a lighthouse horror tale where its light doesn't just guide ships, it calls them. Keepers have vanished into the fog for decades, swallowed by the sea, ghostly forces, and a supernatural mystery older than time itself. Stay close to the fire, lean in, and listen carefully, because this is the chilling story of the ghostly keeper and the night terror that haunts the cliffs. The wind coming off the ocean carried a sharp bite, the kind that slipped beneath your coat and sank into the bone. Emily stood at the edge of the cliff, staring at the lighthouse that rose like a wounded sentinel above the restless waves. The world here felt muted, swallowed by mist, stripped of color and sound, until all that remained was the rhythmic crash of the sea and the faint hum of the light turning far above her. She had seen lighthouses before, but not like this one. This tower was different. Its paint was cracked and peeled, the iron railing rusted to the color of dried blood. The windows were opaque with salt, reflecting nothing but the pale fog that drifted endlessly across the water. There was a kind of stillness about the place that felt unnatural, a silence that didn't belong to the living. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag and began to climb the narrow path toward the entrance. Her boots slid slightly on the wet stones, and with every step she felt the strange awareness of being watched. Not by people, but by the place itself. The lighthouse loomed higher with every breath, its shape warping in the fog until it seemed less like a structure and more like a presence. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of brine, oil, and decay. The walls were damp, the wooden floor soft from years of moisture. The echo of her footsteps lingered longer than it should have, returning to her ears a second later. Softer, almost as if someone were walking just behind her. She turned, but the staircase wound down into darkness, empty and hollow. The keeper's quarters were small, barely large enough for a cot, a desk, and a shelf lined with dusty journals. She ran her hand across the cracked leather spines, feeling the faint impression of initials etched into one of them. E.T., the last keeper. She opened it and read a few lines. The handwriting was tight and uneven, the words trembling across the page as though written by a shaking hand. The light behaves differently now. It doesn't just warn ships anymore. It calls them. Emily felt a strange chill that wasn't from the wind. She closed the book and set it aside, telling herself it was just the imagination of a lonely man driven to madness by isolation. But even as she thought it, she couldn't ignore the uneasy weight pressing against her chest, the whisper of a thought she couldn't name, that perhaps he hadn't been mad at all. Outside, the fog thickened, rolling over the cliff like smoke. The beacon above began to spin, its light cutting through the haze in long, slow sweeps. For a moment, Emily could swear she saw movement in the glow. Faint shapes shifting where there should have been nothing. She blinked, but they were gone, leaving only the relentless rhythm of the waves below. Night came quickly on the coast. The sea turned black and the horizon vanished into nothing. The lighthouse moaned under the force of the wind, its frame trembling as if alive. In her small room, Emily lit a lantern and tried to read, but her mind refused to focus. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of wood, the groan of metal, the distant roar of water colliding with stone. And beneath it all, she began to hear something else. It was faint at first, barely there. A sound like whispering, muffled and distant, rising and falling with the pulse of the sea. She froze, holding her breath, listening. The whispers didn't come from outside. They came from the walls. She stepped closer, pressing her ear against the cold plaster. The sound was there. Not words exactly, but something close. The rhythm of it reminded her of voices carried through water, soft and distorted, impossible to understand, yet filled with intent. It was almost as if the lighthouse itself was trying to speak. Sleep came late, uneasy and thin. In her dreams, she saw flashes of light moving across the ocean, not from ships, but from beneath the waves. Figures drifted in the current, their faces pale and blurred, reaching toward her with open hands. When she woke, the room was still and silent. Yet she could feel something lingering in the air, something that hadn't fully left when she opened her eyes. At dawn, she climbed the spiral staircase to the top of the tower. The steps were narrow, slick with condensation, and the air grew colder with each turn. When she reached the lantern room, she stood before the great glass lens. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. Massive, gleaming, and alive with motion. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, slow and steady. And for one disorienting moment, Emily felt it sinking with her own. She stepped back, gripping the railing, forcing herself to look away. Beyond the glass, the sea stretched endless and gray, the horizon lost in fog. Somewhere out there, waves crashed against hidden rocks, and the cries of gulls sounded like distant human voices. Emily closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. She had come here for solitude, for quiet work far from the noise of her old life. But now she realized solitude here was not the absence of people. It was the presence of something else entirely. The lighthouse didn't just stand against the sea. It watched it. It listened. And now, she was certain it had started to watch her too. The second night came with a kind of heaviness that clung to everything. The air, the sea, even her own thoughts. Emily woke several times before realizing she hadn't truly slept at all. The silence of the island was too complete, broken only by the groaning of wood and the hiss of the tide below. She had never known quiet could sound so loud. She tried to convince herself the unease was just the isolation settling in, the body's way of resisting the unfamiliar. But there was something about the rhythm of the sea that didn't feel right, as if the waves struck the shore in answer to something else, something deeper and older than wind or tide. By morning, a thin mist still hung low over the cliffs. She walked the perimeter of the island, tracing the jagged outline where the land met the sea. The rocks were slick and sharp, carved by centuries of storms. Every now and then, she would spot pieces of wreckage lodged between the stones, twisted metal, fragments of hulls, the remnants of ships the Lighthouse had failed to save. She told herself the stories about the light-drawing vessels toward the rocks were nothing but superstition. But the way those rusted fragments gleamed wet and red beneath the gray sky made her stomach tighten. When she returned to the keeper's house, she noticed something new. On the desk lay one of the old journals, open to a page she didn't remember leaving it on. The writing was darker now, thicker, as if it had been pressed into the paper with a shaking hand. It's not the sea that kills them. It's the light. The light wants them. She stared at the page for a long moment, the words swimming before her eyes. A strange smell filled the room, the sharp tang of metal and salt. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. Emily shut the book, her hands trembling slightly, and placed it back on the shelf. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. That night, the whispers came again, louder this time. They rose and fell, with the hum of the machinery that powered the beacon, like voices carried on the rhythm of a pulse. Sometimes they seemed to come from the floorboards beneath her feet. Other times they echoed from the narrow stairwell that spiraled upward into the tower. Lying in bed, she felt an almost magnetic pull, the strange, inexplicable urge to climb the stairs and stand before the light. Every rational thought told her to stay put, to ignore it. But reason was no match for whatever called her name in the dark. She found herself ascending the staircase barefoot, her lantern trembling in her grip. The walls felt damp, alive with moisture and movement, as if they were breathing with her. Each step echoed in the hollow shaft of the tower, and with every turn she felt the space behind her grow thicker, heavier, like invisible hands reaching just beyond sight. When she reached the top, the lantern room was bathed in a dim, pulsing glow. The great Fresnel lens rotated slowly, casting long ribbons of light across the fog. For a moment, she thought she saw faces in the glass, faint outlines of eyes, mouths, the contours of people trapped in the reflection. But when she blinked, they were gone, leaving only the rhythmic spin of the light. She moved closer. The glass was cold to the touch, slick with condensation. The light's pulse quickened, matching the frantic pace of her heartbeat. She could feel the hum of the mechanism through her fingertips, vibrating faintly, almost like breath beneath skin. The whispering was clearer here. It wasn't in her head anymore. It was all around her. 1,000 faint murmurs overlapping, pulling at her thoughts, forming sounds that weren't words, but carried meaning all the same. An invitation, a command, a promise. Emily stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. The flame inside wavered and died, plunging her into the soft, eerie glow of the beacon alone. In that instant, she felt utterly seen, not as a person, but as something the light had found. She fled down the stairs, her bare feet slipping on the metal steps. By the time she reached the bottom, her lungs burned, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She locked the door behind her, though she knew it was useless. Whatever this was didn't live outside those walls. It was the walls. The rest of the night passed in fragments. Half sleep, fleeting sounds, the sense of movement in the corners of her vision. Each time she opened her eyes, the faint glow of the beacon reached through the window, shifting across the room like a slow, deliberate searchlight. By dawn, she was exhausted, her mind stretched thin. The morning fog had thickened to a milky gray that swallowed the island whole. The ocean was silent now, unnaturally so. No gulls, no waves, no wind. Just the distant, rhythmic rotation of the light above her. She brewed a cup of coffee and tried to steady herself. On the windowsill lay something she hadn't noticed before. A small seashell, smooth and perfectly white, placed there as if by a careful hand. She picked it up and turned it over in her palm. Inside, faintly etched into its spiral, were tiny marks. Letters. It took her a moment to recognize the shape of them. E.T. The initials from the journal. The name of the last keeper. The shell slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor. She stared at the fragments, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. There was no one else on this island. As the day wore on, the whispers subsided, but the silence that replaced them felt worse. It was an expectant kind of quiet, the kind that pressed against the ears and waited. Every hour she caught herself glancing toward the tower, wondering if the light was still spinning, if it was searching. By sunset, the fog began to glow faintly, as if reflecting a hidden fire somewhere far beyond sight. The first beam of the lighthouse swept across the island, cutting through the haze in long, slow arcs. For a fleeting moment, Emily thought she saw something move in the fog. A shadow shifting just at the edge of the beam, too fluid to be human. She stood at the window long after dark, unable to look away. The beam passed over the rocks, over the water, over her. Each time it did, she felt that same pull, the same sick, magnetic draw toward the light. She didn't know it yet, but that was how it began for all of them. The fog didn't lift the next morning. It just thickened, swallowing the island until the sea vanished entirely. The world became nothing but gray, a heavy, breathing kind of gray that felt alive. Emily woke to the sound of the generator struggling beneath the floorboards, its low hum echoing through the walls like a dying heartbeat. She moved through the keeper's quarters in silence, every creak of the wood making her flinch. The air tasted of metal and salt, and she couldn't tell if it was from the sea or from the blood she'd bitten into her lip the night before. Sleep had been a shapeless blur, fragments of dreams that didn't belong to her, faces floating beneath the water, eyes staring from behind the glass of the lighthouse lens, hands reaching out of the fog. When she looked in the mirror above the sink, she barely recognized her own reflection. The skin under her eyes was dark, her face pale, drawn tight with exhaustion. But there was something else, something in her eyes that didn't belong. A faint reflection of movement, as though something deep inside them was shifting, watching back. By midday, the sound of a boat engine cut faintly through the mist. Emily rushed outside, heart pounding. Through the fog, she saw a shadow. Small, flickering, distant. A fishing boat. Relief flooded her chest. Someone was out there. She waved, shouted, though the wind tore her voice away before it could carry. The boat didn't seem to see her. It drifted aimlessly, turning in slow circles, as if caught in a current she couldn't see. Then the light from the lighthouse swept across the water, and in that moment the boat seemed to shimmer, its shape bending, melting into the fog. When the beam passed again, the sea was empty. No sound, no trace. Emily stood frozen, unable to breathe. The air around her vibrated with the faint hum of the lighthouse above. It wasn't just coincidence. The light had touched the boat, and the boat was gone. She backed away from the edge of the cliff and ran inside, slamming the door behind her. Her hands shook so badly she could barely lock it. She told herself she had imagined it, that the fog distorted distance and shape, that the sea played tricks on the eyes. But deep down, she knew she hadn't imagined anything. The light had taken it. As the hours passed, a strange restlessness took hold of her. Every tick of the clock seemed too loud. Every gust of wind against the windows felt deliberate, rhythmic, like a knocking, subtle but insistent. When she checked the door, there was no one there. But on the other side of the glass, she thought she saw movement. Faint, shadow-like forms sliding through the fog, their edges shifting like smoke. At sunset, the light began to turn. Its glow poured through the windows, cutting long golden lines through the dim interior. Wherever the light touched, the air seemed to shimmer, to distort slightly, as if the fabric of the world was thinning. Emily backed into the corner, breathing shallowly, her mind racing. Then the whispers started again. But this time, they were not faint. They came clearly from the stairwell, low, steady like chanting beneath the wind. She forced herself to move closer, though every instinct screamed to run. The steps were cold beneath her hands. She peered upward. The beam of the light swept across the tower, illuminating the staircase for just a moment. And in that brief flash, she saw them. Figures. Dozens of them pressed against the inner wall, pale and translucent, their eyes black and empty. They didn't move, didn't breathe. They just stared down at her as the light passed, their shapes trembling like reflections in rippling water. Then the light turned again, and they were gone. Emily fell back, hitting the floor, the breath torn from her lungs. Her body refused to move, every nerve frozen in terror. The tower above groaned, a deep metallic sound that vibrated through her skull. It felt like the building was alive, stretching, breathing, watching. She crawled to her cot and sat there until her body stopped shaking. She tried to think rationally, to find logic in what she'd seen. Sleep deprivation, isolation, the flickering of light through fog, all of it could make the mind invent patterns. But the fear she felt wasn't the fear of imagination. It was recognition. Something ancient inside her knew this terror. Later that night, she woke to the sound of dripping. The air was colder now, wet with condensation. She sat up and saw the floor glistening with small pools of water that hadn't been there before. It ran from the doorway like a trail. She followed it. The water led her down the hallway toward the base of the lighthouse. The closer she got, the louder the sound became. Not just dripping now, but a slow, rhythmic slosh, like waves gently striking ashore. She opened the door to the stairwell and froze. Water covered the first few steps, reflecting the faint light from above. It shimmered faintly, as if lit from within, and beneath its surface, for the briefest moment, she thought she saw faces. Pale, unmoving, floating upward from the depths. Their mouths open in silent cries. The light turned again overhead, casting its beam through the tower, and the reflection on the water shifted. The faces vanished. She stumbled back, slamming the door shut, heart pounding so violently it hurt. The noise of the generator flickered, sputtered, and then died completely. The tower fell into silence. The light, however, did not. It kept spinning. Its beam continued to cut through the fog, steady and deliberate, though nothing powered it now. And as the room filled with that unnatural glow, Emily realized the truth she had been trying to ignore. The lighthouse didn't need a keeper. It never had. The light was its own pulse, its own hunger. And she, like all the others before her, had already been chosen. By dawn, Emily had stopped trying to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same thing. The light sweeping across the black water, the faint outlines of faces trapped within its glow. The sound of waves had faded hours ago. Now, the only sound was the slow, mechanical turn of the lighthouse lens above her head, still spinning without power, like a heart that refused to die. She lit one of the old kerosene lamps she'd found in the storage room, the flame trembling in the damp air. The generator was silent, the wiring dead. But somehow the light continued. Its hum pulsed through the floorboards and into her bones. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening here wasn't mechanical. She climbed the spiral stairs, each step groaning under her weight. The higher she went, the stronger the vibration became. A deep, rhythmic throb that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. Halfway up, she paused, pressing her palm to the cold iron rail. It felt alive, faintly warm, almost pulsing beneath her hand, like veins carrying blood instead of rust. When she reached the top, the smell of ozone and salt filled her lungs. The lens room was bathed in the same golden white light, swirling endlessly. She stepped closer to the glass and saw the beam sweep across the fog. Vast, beautiful, and utterly wrong. For a moment, she thought she saw movement inside the light itself. Shadowy shapes twisting, stretching, trying to break free. Her reflection in the glass distorted, shifting between her own face and others. Faces she didn't recognize, but somehow remembered. Men in old uniforms. A woman in a long dress, hair matted with seaweed. A child with hollow eyes. Then, just as quickly, they were gone. On the table beside the lens, she noticed a notebook. Old, leather-bound, its pages curled with moisture. It must have belonged to one of the previous keepers. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was sharp and erratic, lines drawn over lines, as though whoever wrote it had been trying to outrun their own thoughts. She flipped through the pages. The light calls to the sea. They told us never to let it go dark. It feeds on reflection, on memory, on us. The further she read, the more frenzied the words became. Scrawled warnings, sketches of spirals, eyes, and waves merging into the same pattern. One entry made her hands tremble as she traced the words with her finger. The light is not built. It's bound. The tower is a prison, not a beacon. She stared at that sentence until her vision blurred. Bound prison. Outside, the fog churned like boiling smoke. It pressed against the glass, rolling and folding over itself. Somewhere in the distance, a low horn moaned, deep and mournful. But it didn't sound like a ship. It sounded alive. Suddenly, the lens flickered. For the first time since she'd arrived, the light dimmed, just for a heartbeat. And in that darkness, she saw the room as it truly was. The walls were wet, slick with condensation that wasn't just water. It glistened red in the lamplight. The air smelled faintly of iron. When the beam flared back to life, The illusion returned. Clean walls, polished brass. But the image of that brief moment stayed burned into her mind. She stumbled back down the stairs, clutching the journal to her chest. She had to leave. Somehow. Even if the fog hid the sea, even if no boats came. She couldn't stay another night. She began gathering her things, hands shaking so violently she dropped the lantern twice. But when she reached for the front door, it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the wood refused to move, as if sealed from the outside. She tried the windows, all stuck. It was as though the building itself had decided she wasn't allowed to leave. Her pulse hammered in her ears. The hum of the light deepened, vibrating through the floor. Then she heard it again. The whispers. Louder now. Closer. They came from the walls, from beneath the floor, from inside her head. Words she couldn't quite make out, except for one, repeated again and again, merging with the wind and her own breath. Keeper. The journal slipped from her hands and fell open on the floor. A new page she hadn't seen before. One that looked fresh, the ink still dark. When the light chooses you, you belong to it. When the sea goes quiet, it's because it's listening. Emily's vision blurred. The air was so thick now it felt like breathing through water. Her ears rang with a high, electric tone that made her teeth ache. She backed toward the staircase, clutching the railing for balance. The light from above began to pulse faster. Not steady now, but erratic, frantic. Every time it flashed, she saw glimpses of something crawling through the fog outside, something enormous moving just beyond sight. The entire tower shuddered with each rotation of the beam. Her knees buckled. She fell to the ground, gasping, the vibration shaking her ribs. The whispers grew louder, twisting into screams. The light flared again, and for an instant she saw the lens filled not with glass, but with eyes. Hundreds of them. Human, animal, some too large to belong to anything that had ever walked the earth. Then everything went still. The light stopped turning. The silence that followed was absolute. Emily lay there, shaking, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The air felt heavy, like the island itself was holding its breath. And then, from somewhere deep beneath the floor, she heard a sound. A slow, deliberate creak, like a hatch opening. And the whisper returned, closer than ever. Keeper. The light must never die. She looked up toward the stairwell, where the faint glow of the lens had returned. The fog outside seemed to pulse in time with it. One breath, one rhythm. Something deep inside her broke then, and another part, quiet, ancient, and resigned, took its place. She understood what the others had meant in their journals. The light was not powered by oil or electricity. It was powered by them. And now, it was her turn. The morning came without sunlight. Just a dull gray pulse behind the fog, seeping weakly through the narrow window like a dying breath. The air inside the lighthouse was colder now, so cold that her skin burned when she touched the walls. Emily didn't remember falling asleep, but she woke sitting on the floor beside the journal, her clothes damp, her fingers raw from gripping the metal railing through the night. She felt hollow, like something had been carved out of her during the hours she couldn't recall. Her mind was blank at first, peaceful almost, but then the silence pressed in again. The hum beneath the floorboards started faintly, like a heartbeat stirring back to life. The light was spinning again. She rose unsteadily, her legs trembling as she climbed the stairs once more. The tower seemed smaller now, the spiral tighter, the air heavier. The glow above pulsed through the walls in slow, hypnotic waves. When she reached the lantern room, she stopped. The journal was no longer in her hand. It was already there, on the table by the lens, opened to a new page she hadn't written. The handwriting looked like hers, but sharper, like it had been carved into the paper instead of written. The light must always have a keeper. When one breaks, another takes their place. You will understand soon. Her throat tightened. She ran her hand across the page, and the ink smeared under her touch. Not wet, but warm. Outside, the fog throbbed with light, glowing faintly as if something within it was breathing. Shapes flickered, forms that almost looked human, floating just beyond the glass. The beam swept across them, and their outlines dissolved, melting back into the mist. Emily pressed her palms against the cold metal of the lens. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, though she knew the question was pointless. The tower didn't answer with words. It answered with memory. The world around her flickered. For a heartbeat, the room wasn't hers. It belonged to someone else. A man stood where she stood now, his uniform torn, his eyes wild with exhaustion. He was screaming, though no sound came out. Then another flash. A woman in a soaked dress, staring through the glass, her reflection splitting into dozens of identical faces. Another flash. An older keeper, kneeling before the lens, his hands bleeding as he fed something invisible into the light. Each time, they vanished just as quickly, leaving behind the faint smell of salt and burning oil. When she looked down again, the journal's pages were blank. Every word, every drawing, gone. Her chest tightened. The tower was erasing them, erasing their stories. "No," she said out loud, though her voice barely carried above the hum. "You don't get to keep me." The words trembled in the air, brave and fragile, like a candle in the wind. Something in the lighthouse responded. The hum deepened, lower, angrier. The beam of the light snapped, freezing mid-turn, its glow flaring white-hot. The air shook. Emily stumbled back as the floor cracked beneath her feet, revealing faint lines of light crawling upward like veins. The metal walls groaned, warping inward as though the entire tower was breathing, drawing her closer to the lens. She turned and ran down the stairs, her heartbeat matching the rhythm of that impossible pulse. But the farther she ran, the less the stairs made sense. The spiral twisted endlessly, descending and ascending at the same time. The architecture folded around her like a trap. Every landing looked the same. Every door led back to the same hallway. She was inside the heartbeat now. "Stop!" she screamed, slamming her hands against the wall. "Stop!" But the light only grew brighter. Its pulse became pain, an unbearable vibration behind her eyes, searing into her skull. Images flashed across her vision, waves swallowing ships, faces trapped beneath the water, the beam of the lighthouse turning endlessly through centuries of storms. The light was not protecting travelers. It was calling them, drawing them toward the rocks, feeding, and every keeper before her had helped it do so. Her body collapsed to the floor, trembling. Tears streamed down her face, though she didn't remember crying. The whispers returned, gentle this time, coaxing. "Keeper, you understand now. You belong here. Keep the light alive." Emily forced herself to her knees. "No," she whispered. "I won't be part of this." She stumbled toward the maintenance hatch at the base of the tower, the one she'd seen in the blueprints, the one that led to the power cables and the foundation. The whispers followed her, louder with each step. The walls flickered with light, casting silhouettes of figures reaching out from within the metal. She ripped the hatch open. The air that poured out was freezing and wet, reeking of salt and something ancient. She climbed down into the darkness, her lantern swinging wildly in her shaking hand. The tunnel beneath the lighthouse was narrow, carved into rock, dripping with seawater. And then she saw it. The source. The base of the light. It wasn't machinery at all, it was alive. A pulsing mass of veins and tendrils, woven through metal and stone, glowing faintly gold. It moved with each turn of the beam above, contracting, feeding. Embedded within it were fragments of bones, pieces of old uniforms, jewelry, teeth. The keepers. Emily fell to her knees, gagging, the horror almost too much to bear. But through the terror came something else, clarity, the truth of what had to be done. She lifted the lantern. The flame flickered against the damp air. Her hand trembled violently, but she forced herself to hold it steady. "I'm not your keeper," she said through her teeth. and with every ounce of strength she had left, she hurled the lantern into the heart of the light. The explosion was silent. No fire, no sound. Just a violent burst of white that swallowed everything. The tower screamed, a sound deeper than the ocean, ancient and grieving. The light flared one last time, brighter than the sun. And then darkness. For the first time in decades, the lighthouse went dark. The fog began to thin. The hum faded. The sea exhaled. And on the empty shoreline below, where the waves met the rocks, the first hint of dawn broke through. The storm broke 2 days later. The Coast Guard patrol found the island by accident. A gray shadow drifting through the last of the fog, where no signal had come from in weeks. The sea was unnaturally calm, flat as glass, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. The rescue team approached cautiously, the sound of their engine echoing across the still water. The captain, a man named Wilkes, had been in the service 20 years, and yet he said later he'd never seen weather like that. The clouds hung too low. The horizon looked wrong, bent like the world had folded in on itself. When the beam of the searchlight hit the shore, they saw the lighthouse standing tall at the island's edge. The tower was dark, the glass shattered, the metal casing of the lens cracked open like the ribs of a dead animal. No radio signals, no fire, no movement. They anchored offshore and went in on a small inflatable boat. The sand was cold beneath their boots. Seagulls circled above, silent. No wind. The keeper's quarters were found first. Overturned furniture, damp walls, pages of a journal scattered across the floor. Most were ruined, the ink dissolved into meaningless black swirls. But a few words could still be read, pressed deep into the paper as if written with desperation. The light feeds. It's older than the sea. When it goes dark, don't look at the water. Wilkes pocketed the pages without telling the others. Something about the air felt wrong, thick, like breathing through smoke. The men kept their radios on, though all they got was static. Every frequency was drowned in a faint, rhythmic hum. When they reached the base of the tower, they found the hatch open. The air that drifted out was colder than it should have been, carrying the smell of iron and decay. They descended slowly. The tunnel below was partially flooded, ankle-deep in salt water. One of the men, Torres, called out. He'd found something in the water. A piece of fabric, torn and soaked. It looked like part of a uniform, the kind worn by lighthouse keepers decades ago. And then they found her. Emily was sitting against the wall at the end of the passage, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. Her eyes were open, staring into the dark. But there was no fear on her face, only calm, almost peace. She was cold to the touch, but she looked untouched. No sign of injury, The lantern lay shattered beside her, the wick blackened, long burned out. Wilkes called it in, his voice trembling despite himself. They covered her with a sheet and prepared to bring her back up. That's when the generator roared to life. No one had touched it. No one even knew it could still run. The sound filled the entire tower, deep and guttural, like something waking from a long sleep. The floor trembled beneath them. Then, slowly, the light above began to turn. Wilkes shouted to cut the power, but there was no power to cut. The wires were severed, the switchboard corroded through. Still, the beam turned. It swept across the sea, pale and perfect. The fog rolled back like a curtain, and for a brief, impossible moment, every man on that island swore they saw movement beneath the water. Hundreds of pale forms, rising, drifting, eyes open, faces turned toward the light. The beam passed again, and the water was empty. When it was over, the light flickered twice and went out. They left the island at dawn. None of them spoke much on the trip back. Wilkes sealed the recovered pages in a weatherproof bag and handed them to the harbor office, where they disappeared into an archive. The report filed that day said the cause of death was exposure. The malfunctioning light was written off as residual power from the generator. Case closed. But a week later, a fisherman radioed in a sighting. He'd been trawling near the island just before sunrise when a sudden light cut across the horizon. A perfect, steady beam sweeping through the mist. The Coast Guard sent a patrol. They found nothing. No power. No flame. No sign of life. Still, the man swore he'd seen it. The light turning slow and steady, just as it had for 100 years before. Months later, a new keeper was assigned. Routine maintenance, they said, just to ensure the structure was sound. His name was Daniel Price, 32, former Navy. He laughed when they told him the old stories, cursed light, ghost ship rumors, missing crews. Superstition, he said. People see what they want in the dark. On his first night, the fog rolled in, just as it always had. The wind died, the radio cut out, and the hum began again, low, rhythmic, pulsing beneath the floor. He climbed the stairs to the lantern room, flashlight in hand. The glass had been replaced, the lens spotless, the wiring brand new, everything ready. At midnight, he looked out through the window and saw the beam cut across the fog. Smooth, silent, flawless. It shouldn't have been possible. The power was still disconnected for testing. He frowned, stepped closer to the lens. And in its reflection, just for a second, he thought he saw someone standing behind him. A woman, her hair wet, her eyes calm and distant. Then the beam turned, and she was gone. Daniel blinked, heart pounding. He forced a nervous laugh, wiped the condensation from the glass, and looked back out at the endless gray sea. The fog swallowed the horizon whole. The hum deepened, and the light kept turning